Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and I'm joined once again by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to talk with you.
Hey, Brandon. Good to see you.
Today we're doing one of our listener Q&A episodes. We do these sporadically, and most of the time we just take questions from anybody, but today's a special one because we're only taking questions from non-Catholics. This includes a lot of atheist listeners, agnostic listeners, Protestant listeners. They've sent in a ton of great questions, and We've got a lot of them lined up here. So instead of wasting time, let's just dive right into them. So first up, we have a question from Valerie, and he's wondering, as a Christian, have you ever had doubts about God's existence? Here's his question.
Okay.
As a Christian, do you ever think, what if God doesn't exist? And then what?
Yeah, that's the question, I suppose. How would I get at it? I think there are very persuasive reasons to ground one's belief in God. So I've been an advocate for a long time of arguments for God's existence. I think you can make a very persuasive, rational case for God's existence. Having said that, is there always something necessarily elusive about God? Yeah. If God is not an item in the world, but the creator of the whole world, if God is not a conditioned object, but the unconditioned reality that stands behind all conditioned things, by definition, I can't have God. And so there's a kind of rationalistic temptation to say, just as like right now I see Brandon on the screen. Right now, I know exactly what I'm doing. Yeah, sure, I can control this dimension of the conditioned realm, but I can never know God in that way. That's why in the Bible it says, the God of Israel is a hidden God. It doesn't mean just provisionally hidden, like I can hide behind a rock. It means that God is, by his very nature, hidden to our consciousness. Now, not to the point of like I have no idea, but to the point that I can never grasp with utter confidence the way I grasp, an object in front of me. So in that sense, there's always a play of light and shadow, if you want, when it comes to God. I wouldn't call that doubting God's existence. That's too strong. It's not right. But it's acknowledging the always elusive character of God, Your specific question, like, if God doesn't exist, then what, is a good question, because if God doesn't exist, there are no objective moral values. And we could spell that argument out in detail, but I think that follows. If God doesn't exist, there's no way finally to explain a contingent world that we clearly live in. If God doesn't exist, our sort of moral and epistemic program falls apart. So I think that's true. That's true. So if you're a real atheist, that you say there is no God, I think you've got to accept those implications, that morality becomes simply a matter of subjective whim and fancy, that you can't finally explain the contingent world that we live in. So I think that's the then what, if you really say God does not exist.
Great question, Valerie. Next up, we got a question from Joe. He's an atheist in New York, and he's got a question about Adam and Eve. Here's Joe.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm from Albany, New York. I'm an atheist. My question is, how are Adam and Eve considered culpable of disobedience if they had no knowledge of good and evil until after they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? In effect, they lacked a moral compass, only to be judged as if they had one. How do you justify this concept with God's nature of justice, mercy, and logic? And if the story is merely metaphorical, how do you account for original sin?
Yeah, good. Joe, I'd go back to John Paul II's reading of this story. And you're quite right in saying we're not dealing here with an historical account or a journalistic account. I mean, so the story of Adam and Eve in the beginning of the book of Genesis is what you call like a religious saga. I've always liked the way Karl Barth characterizes that. So we're meant to look at the sort of deep spiritual and theological import of the story rather than to analyze it as a scientific account. Okay, so let's say that clearly. But John Paul II read it this way. The grasping at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is arrogating to oneself the prerogative of determining good and evil. So in a way, your question is quite insightful because you're getting at the, call it meta level. it's not an issue simply of, oh, Adam and Eve did a bad thing, so I perform a bad moral act. It's much more fundamental than that. It's prior, if you want, to any particular bad act that we do. It's the seizing on our own. That's the grasping of it, the seizing of this prerogative which belongs to God alone. And precisely because of what you said, that God's very nature is to be true and to be just. God is the unconditioned good. Therefore, he is in himself the criterion of good and evil. When I grasp at that and say, no, my freedom is the criterion of good and evil, then we tumble out of the garden. We tumble out of the right relationship with God. So what I would do, Joe, is follow your question. It's a darn good question because you're intuiting the deeper dimension of this story and how it is indeed getting at something more than just, oh, that's a single transgression. Oh, there was a bad boy and a bad girl transgressing a moral law. It's getting to a much deeper thing, which involves all of us. See, so it's not just a story of, oh, what happened long ago. It's what happens all the time, if you want, in the depth of our kind of twisted moral consciousness. Is, I've often said it's as contemporary as the headlines today. My freedom. I determine what's right and wrong. It's up to me. That's, if you want, the original sin. Now, read original here, not so much chronologically as ontologically. What's the meta? That's a different metaphor, kind of going beyond. But what's the fundamental, foundational problem, which in turn gives rise to all particular sin? That's the original sin that's being described there.
Bishop, I've sometimes heard a parallel question involving Lucifer. People will say, God created all the angels good, they're pure, they're holy, they have no capacity to sin, I think. So then how did Lucifer turn away from God? Where did that come from?
Well, it comes from the combination of freedom and finitude. I mean, so if an agent is free, as an angel is, but yet finite, there's the capacity for turning away. And is there something, I think, Brandon, this is a deep thing, the more you think about it. Is there something like a test that is necessary for full moral engagement? You know what I'm saying? Is there a moment, and is this part of what our life is about? Is there a moment of real moral testing to see what your mettle is? That is it this or that? And I think of Bob Dylan's, you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil, might be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. Well, there's a moment, and Dylan's song reflects Joshua, doesn't it? When Joshua goes, I don't know about all you, but for me and my family, we're going to serve the Lord. What that implies is Joshua was tempted. There was something like, do I follow the gods of this new land I'm in, or do I follow Yahweh, the God of Israel? I will follow Yahweh. There was something about the test that gave him moral integrity. Now, we're speculating when it comes to the angels and all that, but is there something like a real test that was involved? Okay, which is it? Which way do you go? And if you're free and finite, then it's possible to fall, And was there a primeval test of the angels? Is that reflected in that language of the warfare of the angels, et cetera? I think there's something really right there, And now an angel, metaphysically, once he's made his choice, it's a choice forever, just given the nature of an angel's ontological constitution. Where we, you might say, thank God, our moral life unfolds over time. So the capacity for conversion is there, I make a bad moral choice, I can regroup and I can undo that choice and choose differently. But that's taking us a little too far afield, I suppose.
Well, let's turn now to John. He lives in Washington State, and he's asking a question about Jesus, his disciples, and miracles. Here's John.
Hello, Bishop. My name is John, a non-believer from Washington State. My issue is with the disciples' betrayal and desertion of Jesus, because even before the resurrection, Jesus allegedly performed several amazing miracles before the disciples' very eyes. These miracles, if they actually happened, already prove that Jesus is divine. So why did Peter betray him and the disciples desert him? It doesn't add up for me.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. It's a basic biblical theme. It's even before the New Testament. Go back to the miracles that God wrought in Egypt as he frees the Israelites from slavery. And then right away, Israel falls back into the worship of false gods. And often we hear in the Old Testament, he did these things for you in Egypt, and after these amazing, portents in Egypt, and yet, you fall back. I think, and see, to me, that's not really puzzling. I just know myself that I've experienced, wonderful things from another human being, wonderful acts of kindness and wonderful acts of friendship, and yet I can fall into cruel speech and cruel behavior. You know what I mean? I just think it's part of the mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of evil, that even though we've seen lots of evidence, we still can fall back. I don't know. I hear you saying that it's a block for you. I don't see it as a puzzlement. To me, that makes a certain amount of sense, given how kind of imperfect and fallen and flawed we all are. Because, I think that's true. They did see Jesus perform miracles, but yet when their life was threatened, put it in that situation. It wasn't just like, hey, I wonder if maybe I'll follow this guy. At a key moment, the disciples, it was life and death. Remember the scene in the Passion narrative when Peter's in the courtyard of the high priest's house and they're uncovering because of his accent. Oh, he was with them. Well, they weren't just whistling Dixie. That was deadly serious business, that he was in danger of being arrested and put to death, right? Well, I mean, at that moment, he forgot every miracle. He forgot everything Jesus had done. He was so afraid for his life. I get that. I think that I understand how that would happen to people. So the amazing thing is, I think after the coming of the Holy Spirit, when the disciples went to their deaths, affirming and confirming all that Jesus said and did, there was the power of the Holy Spirit in them. But I think the mystery of iniquity, the mystery of evil, explains adequately how we fall away from even this kind of glaring evidence to the contrary.
It strikes me the difference in category between Jesus' early miracles, where he's feeding a bunch of people, he's walking across the water, and rising from the dead and coming back and offering forgiveness. That miracle was enough to change the hearts of the disciples.
Yeah, and the other ones that are anticipating in different ways. But heck, I mean, even go back to I know it's an apocryphal story, but the Quo Vadis, story of Peter, even after the resurrection, even after all that, and he's leaving Rome, or rather he sees the Lord, as he's trying to escape persecution. So even there, there was a temptation to run away. So I get that. That to me doesn't seem very puzzling.
Okay, next up is Sarah, who lives in Paris, and she's asking about the way that we talk about God. Here's Sarah.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Sarah, and I live in Paris. My question is this. Why is God almost exclusively referred to as a masculine entity in the Catholic Church? I have heard many Catholics, including Catholic priests, avoid clearly and fully answering the question, so I'm hoping you can. Thank you.
Yeah, good. And maybe it's because it's a kind of a subtle, complex thing to respond to. Maybe that's why you haven't gotten a fully adequate response. Not that I can give one, but say a couple things. I mean, clearly God, the unconditioned reality, is a spirit. And that means, it doesn't mean like he's a ghostly figure as opposed to a material figure. It means that God is beyond any of the metaphysical categories. So Aquinas will say God's not a body, God's not material, God's not in time, God's not in space. All those negative things are meant to say God's manner of being is outside of our usual categories, right? Now, one of our categories, bodiliness, and then within bodiliness, gender. So those are all ways that we talk about conditioned objects. Clearly, none of that applies to God. And so we should never think, if you refer to God as he, that we're imagining God as a gendered entity, right? So please just get that out of your mind. That's not at all what we're talking about. Do we, in fact, exclusively use masculine language when talking about God? I'd say no, because the Bible uses at times feminine metaphors for talking about God, that God's love is like that of a mother, that we might nurse with delight at her abundant breast. So the psalm talks about that at Jerusalem, and that God, like a mother, will feed his people. Could a mother forget her child? Even if she forgets, I will never forget you. So the Bible uses feminine metaphors for talking about God. Now, let's keep pressing it. God takes to himself a human nature as an iconic representation. That's another way of talking about the mystery of the incarnation. God becomes one of us, and he takes to himself, in fact, a gendered nature. He takes to himself the human nature of Jesus of Nazareth. The masculinity of the incarnation is an important part of it. And so there, I think we're going to get a specification. Now, the Council of Chalcedon tells us that the natures in Jesus, divine and human, come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion. So this gendered quality of the incarnation is not compromising God's unconditioned and, in that sense, non-gendered nature. Okay, what I'm doing is trying to just provide certain context for talking about it. Maybe a last observation. Is there something about God's generativity, God's creativity, God's active role in giving rise to finite things that is more compatible with a masculine pronoun? So with the traditionally masculine role of generation and giving rise to, therefore, is it proper to refer to, for example, the first person of the Trinity as the Father who begets, the Son who is begotten, masculine terms? Now, Holy Spirit, the love that obtains between them, depending on the language, is either masculine or feminine, So there it gets a little more subtle too. Now, all of that is just meant to be sort of parameters for approaching this issue and why the church respects that classical language referring to God as he. Finally, I'll say this. None of it is meant, and here I'm going to object to the sort of feminist assumption that God's the ultimate reality. If we call God he, we're saying that men are superior to women, or they're the ultimate reality. Don't make that move. That's just a dumb move. That's, I know, part of the sort of feminist agenda and ideology, but it doesn't imply that by any means. The church clearly teaches of the fundamental equality of men and women, the equal dignity of men and women, et cetera. So it's never meant to say, oh, men are more godlike than women. So don't go down that road at all. So maybe with those clarifications and parameters in place, we can approach an answer to that question.
We've talked before about Dr. Brant Petrie and his great book on Jesus as bridegroom and God as the bride who wants to marry the church. It strikes me that as God is almost exclusively referred to in masculine terms, the church is almost exclusively referred to in feminine terms, and that those two things together tell us something very important about this ultimate reality. Yeah.
I think so, Brandon. That's generativity, both in the sense of creation, but also of redemption, because the bride-bridegroom thing is getting at, redemption, whereby we're brought up into a real share in the divine life. And so the soul classically is seen as more feminine, as receptive, as that which is transfigured. So, I think all that has a role to play in why that particular pronoun is used. But I would just want to press away from the association, between by calling God he, I'm divinizing masculinity. I think that's just not in the mind of the church.
All right, next up we have a question from Erica. She is a Protestant listener from Regina, Canada, and she's asking about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Here is her question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Erica from Regina, Canada. I am a Protestant who feels very drawn to the Catholic faith, and your podcasts have been a big part of that. However, there are a few things that I have trouble accepting, one of the main ones being Mother Mary. Coming from a very biblically based religious background, I don't see evidence in the Bible for the place that she occupies in the Catholic faith. How do I understand her importance in the Catholic faith? And is it an essential part of being Catholic? Thank you for the work you're doing, and I'm so grateful for you and the whole Word on Fire team. Thanks. God bless.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It's a good searching one and requires a really, kind of elaborate answer. I might recommend, Brandon, it's Brant Petrie again, does he have a couple of versions, one more academic, one more popular about Mary.
Yeah, that's
in
right.
the life of the church and the biblical foundations for Marian belief. What's it called again?
Yeah, it's about the woman at the well. I can't remember the exact. Oh,
no, but there's a book. There's a whole book he did on Mary and the biblical roots, didn't he? That's what I'm trying to think
Yeah,
of.
here we
and I was
go.
gonna recommend
Jesus and the Jewish roots of Mary.
That's it. So before I say anything, I might recommend go get that book by Brant Petrie, because Brant is a lifelong Catholic, but came of age very much in dialogue with a Protestant world, and met all those questions as a young man, and it bugged him to the point where he eventually wrote books about it. So if you want to see very strong biblical foundations for belief in Mary, not just within the New Testament, but going back to the Old Testament, and very interesting correspondences. And I'll say one quick thing here. This is nothing new in the life of the church. The earliest fathers of the church saw a strong relationship between Eve and Mary, the new Eve. Eve, the mother of the fallen human race. Mary, the mother of the redeemed race. In the Catholicism series, I rehearsed that wonderful patristic association between Eva, E-V-A, right, Eve, and Ave, the greeting of the angel to Mary. And the church fathers saw the Ave, A-V-E, of the angel, reversing the E-V-A of Eve. The point there is Mary is undoing, by her obedience, the damage done by the disobedience of Eve, and thereby she becomes the mother of all those redeemed. So that motif of Mary as an archetype of the church, Mary as mother of the church, Mary as spiritual generating agent, is a very ancient one. And so the Catholic Church has long recognized Mary as the Theotokos, so she's the bearer of God, also becomes the bearer of God up and down the centuries to us. We're not deifying Mary at all, but we are asking Mary to bear Christ in us. I spent a fair amount of time this morning in my holy hour. I pray my office, but I also pray the rosary. And why am I invoking this ancient Israelite girl over and over again? Hail Mary, full of grace. Hail Mary, full of grace. Because I'm asking her to give birth to Christ in me. So I think for all those reasons, and read Brant Petrie for all the details, but Mary, yes, is essential to our spiritual life, as she was essential to the incarnation. So how beautifully the biblical God never comes bursting in the way the ancient mythological gods do, but through our cooperation. God inviting the cooperation of Mary, which was necessary for the coming of Christ. And so Mary, in the same way, necessary for the birth of Christ within us. So that's, again, a quick answer to a really complex question.
Erica, whenever I was a Protestant and I was exploring Catholicism, I asked a lot of the same questions that you're asking, and I think they're very, very common for any non-Catholic Christian who's exploring Catholicism, because you read the Gospels and you see the scant references to Mary and you think she must not be that important because there's not a lot of space devoted to her. But a few books really helped me, and I wanted to just tick them off real fast. Brant Petrie's book wasn't written until after my conversion, but I've read it.
This is
really
recent,
good. Yeah. Really, really good. Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary, because it doesn't just focus on the gospel accounts of Mary. It shows how she's foreshadowed in the Old Testament and then the book of Revelation, Revelation 12. Two more is Scott Hahn's book, Hail, Holy Queen. That was a real game changer for my understanding of Mary. And then finally, Fulton Sheen's great book called The World's First Love. It's not just a apologetical reflection on Mary, but just a beautiful spiritual and philosophic reflection on her as well. So get any of those three books, I think they'd be a big help to you. Okay, next up, we have a question from Thomas. He's a skeptic from the United Kingdom. I think actually Birmingham, land of John Henry Newman.
John Henry Newman.
So here's Thomas's question.
Hello, it's Thomas Hogan from Birmingham, UK. How can we trust the Bible when evidence shows the Old Testament isn't true, as in the world wasn't created in 7 days and we evolved from monkeys? How can we trust the Old Testament or the New Testament?
Yeah, good, Thomas. Thank you for that. Go back to Vatican II when it talks about the Bible, and it says one of the most important interpretive moves we have to make is to determine what genre we're dealing with when we open the Bible. As I've often said, the Bible is not a book. It's a library of books. It's a collection of books. different authors, different audiences, different cultural settings, different purposes, different theological perspectives, and different genre, right? So when you're going through the library and you go to different sections and you say, what kind of book is this? Is the first question. You open up, like I'm listening right now to Charles Dickens' great Tale of Two Cities. And A Tale of Two Cities is a novel, right? Now it's about historical events. It's about the French Revolution and the lead up to it. So there's a lot of history in it, but it's very important that I know as I listen to that book, oh, this is a novel though. This is not a history. Now, at the same time, I'm reading this new Churchill biography. I'm pointing at my room, that's why I'm pointing that way. I'm reading this Churchill biography. Okay, that's a biography, and it's got thousands of footnotes, and it's by this responsible historical researcher. That's not a novel. That's a history book. So I'm going to approach the Churchill biography and A Tale of Two Cities with different interpretive strategies, with different interpretive lenses in place, right? A grave mistake would be any book I pick up, I'm going to use the same kind of clunky set of interpretive lenses. So the problem is you reference, classically the beginning of the book of Genesis, and we see the account of creation. If I pick that book up and I pick up a book by Stephen Hawking about the origins of the cosmos, and I read them with the same interpretive lenses, I'm going to misread one or the other, or probably both, right? Hawking is a scientific account. It's a astrophysical account or a cosmological account, right? Using the modern physical sciences and empirical observation. The Bible was written so long before we even had the modern physical sciences. It's a different type of book. So when you say it isn't true, that's simply the wrong way to put it. As though I'm going to use the same criteria for determining truth in one case as in the other. What's true about the beginning of the book of Genesis? All kinds of important things about God, about the purpose of creation, about God's relation to creation, about the interdependence of all things, about God's ultimate intentions vis-a-vis the universe, et cetera, et cetera. It's full of all kinds of truths. But I will get those truths clearly only when I approach that book appropriately. So trusting the Bible, I'd say step one, make sure you're reading it right. Make sure you're approaching it with the right lenses, or you won't trust it. You'll be deceived, Like, let's say, go back to the Tale of Two Cities, it's kind of a helpful example. Let's suppose someone not knowing the genre, just assuming, oh, it's a historical account of I guess all these figures really existed, these characters, Madame Defarge knitting. Oh, where was Madame Defarge born, and where is she buried, and is that where she sat while the guillotine fell? Well, those would all be stupid questions, right? No, those are characters in the mind of Charles Dickens. Now, here's why it's interesting as an example. Imposed upon a real historical background. Was there really a guillotine in the middle of Paris? Yeah, there was. In fact, I used to go right by that place. It's now called the Place de la Concorde. It was called the Place de la Révolution. I went by there all the time. That is a real historical place. But superimposed upon that by Dickens is an imaginative story. Now, is that sometimes going on in the Bible? Yeah, sometimes. Some of the texts are like that. You might say a real historical background, but then imposed upon it certain events and conversations and characters that are to some degree the result of the author's imagination. There wasn't somebody with a tape recorder taking down exactly what David said to, right, Bathsheba. So you see my point. My point is I'm trying to make things more complicated for you in a good way, because the question arises from, I think, an overly simplistic way to look at the Bible, when in fact it's a really complicated hermeneutical or interpretive game. Sorry, long answer to a good question.
Bishop, let me ask a follow-up, because I regularly hear this follow-up when you talk about the need to use different interpretive lenses to read each book of the Bible. How do we know which lens to choose for each part of the Bible?
Good. Stay with the Dickens example. How do I know? So I download that the Tale of Two Cities onto my Audible, and I'm listening to it. How do I know what that is? I would say because long, long ago when I was a kid, I heard about this novelist, Charles Dickens. And I learned what novels were from teachers, probably saying, novels like a long story and so on. I read other novels by lots of other people. I recognize what's typical of a novel's way of approaching things. For all these reasons, and all of it disciplined by a tradition of interpretation, I know what's the right lens to use. The Churchill biography. I've read a lot of biographies. In fact, I've read a number of biographies of Churchill. I know what a biography is like. I know by its internal qualities that it has the structure of a biography rather than a novel, right? I look for things like footnotes, like, oh yeah, okay, it's got a lot of footnotes. Dickens' Tale of Two Cities has no footnotes in it because novels don't have footnotes. In other words, my point is, by authority, by tradition, by training, by internal evidence, I come to know what's the right interpretive lens. All of that is true in regard to the Bible. And all of that happens how? Under the discipline of and in the aegis of the church. It's the church over space and time that taught me how to read the Bible. See? Which is why I shouldn't read the Bible apart from the church. That's when a lot of questions, see, Thomas's question, I would say, comes up out of a failure on the part of the church in some ways to teach people how properly to read the Bible.
All right, great question, Thomas. We'll conclude here with one last question. This one's from Jim in Flagstaff. He's asking a question about John Henry Newman, who we just mentioned a couple minutes ago. Here's Jim.
Yeah.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is Jim from Flagstaff, Arizona. I have just heard about John Henry Newman's conversion in your Pivotal Players series. And I wonder, did he have any disagreements with the Catholic Church? Did he have to declare that he believes everything that the Church teaches in order to convert? I ask because I must declare that in order to join the Church. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Did Newman have disagreements with the Catholic Church for a long time? Yeah, absolutely. He was an Anglican, and he was if you want, conservative Anglican, and he was fighting for a more patristic, creedal sort of reading of Anglicanism. He was always resisting the Protestant move, and he wanted to sort of Catholicize the Anglican thing. But having said that, for decades, Newman opposed himself to what he took to be false teachings about the Pope, about Mary, about the saints. And read the Apologia Pro Vita Sua for the details, Newman's great intellectual autobiography. But yeah, he had profound disagreements with the Catholic Church for a long time. He worked his way very gradually through those. Newman did not have a Paul-like conversion, like boom, knocked to the ground, and now I believe. It was a long, somewhat painful, painstaking, intellectually conditioned search, which eventually brought him, and through a lot of different influences, to the point where he said, no, I now believe this is the church that Christ wanted. He overcame his disagreement in regard to Catholicism. Now, the other side of your question is more the kind of going forward question. When one becomes a Catholic, I think one accepts the fact that the church is under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Newman felt that if God has revealed something, which clearly he believed, it would make perfect sense. It would be rational also to assume that God would provide for an interpretive framework so that revelation would not be distorted. And he came to appreciate that as the church in its authority under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So I think in becoming a Catholic, Newman accepted that. He accepted that the Holy Spirit is, in fact, through the authority of the church, guiding the development of doctrine over the centuries. So that's kind of the full answer. And I'd say the same thing to you, that in becoming a Catholic, you'd be saying yes to what the church teaches, and also yes to the guidance of the Holy Spirit, operative in the church as doctrine continues to develop, as it will over time. Never turning back on itself or contradicting itself, but unfolding. And that takes place under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So again, that's maybe too long of an answer to your good question, but Newman did have disagreements. He resolved them, and then he accepted the ongoing influence of the Spirit, I would say.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you to all the other questioners who recorded great questions for the show.
Yeah, very good.
If you're a non-Catholic listener, maybe you're a skeptic, a former Catholic, a Protestant, any other persuasion, we'd love to hear from you. So visit askbishopbarron.com. Maybe you're a Catholic listener and you have a non-Catholic son or daughter, friend, family member. Have them send in their questions. We want to engage them. Also, just one more reminder, please, if you have kids, invite your kids to record questions and send them in. Every now and then we do our kids Q&A episodes with Bishop Barron, which we love. We've done a few of them, and I think we've got a handful of questions lined up for a new one. But if you're a kid or if you're a non-Catholic, we'd especially love to hear from you. AskBishopBarron.com. Listen, thanks so much for listening to the Word on Fire show, and we'll see you next week.